history of the sufferings and death of Jesus Christ, parts number 4 and 5 conflated together. Then the band of soldiers and their captain and the officers of the Jews arrested Jesus and bound him. And they led him away to Annas first, for he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, who was high priest that year. Now Caiaphas was he who gave counsel to the Jews that it was expedient that one man should die for the people. And they led him away to Caiaphas, the high priest. And with him were assembled all the chief priests, the elders, and the scribes. And Simon Peter followed Jesus, and so did another disciple. And that disciple was known to the high priest, and went with Jesus into the courtyard of the high priest. But Peter stood at the door outside. Then that other disciple who was known to the high priest went out and spoke to her who kept the door, and brought Peter in. And the servants and officers who had made a fire of coals stood there, for it was cold, and they warmed themselves. And Peter stood with them and warmed himself, so that he could see at the end. And then the servant girl who kept the door, seeing Peter in the light as he warmed himself, looked intently at him and said, "And you were also with Jesus of Galilee. You're not also one of this man's disciples, are you?" And he denied before all and said, "Woman, I am not. I do not know him. I do not know what you're saying." And the high priest then asked Jesus about his disciples and his doctrine. And Jesus answered him, "I spoke openly to the world. I always taught in the synagogues and in the temple, where the Jews always meet, and in secret I have said nothing. Why do you ask me? Ask those who hear me what I've said to them. Indeed, they know what I said." And when he had said these things, one of the officers who stood by struck Jesus with the palm of his hand, saying, "Do you answer the high priest like that?" And Jesus answered him, "If I have spoken evil, bear witness of the evil. But if well, why do you strike me?" Then Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. And Simon Peter stood and warmed himself. And a little while after the first denial, when he had gone out to the entrance, the rooster crowed, and another girl saw him, and again began to say to those who were there, "This fellow was also with Jesus of Nazareth." Then they said to him, "Aren't you one of his disciples?" And another said, "You are also one of them." And he denied again and swore to it and said, "Man, I am not, and I do not know the man." And after about the space of an hour, another confidently affirmed, saying, "Surely you are also one of them, for you are a Galilean, and your speech betrays you." And one of the servants of the high priest, a relative of him whose ear Peter cut off, said, "Did I not see you in the garden with him?" Then Peter began to curse and swear, "I do not know the man of whom you speak." And immediately, while he was yet speaking, the rooster crowed a second time. And the Lord turned and looked at Peter. And Peter remembered Jesus saying how he had said to him, "Before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times." And he went out and wept bitterly. Now the chief priests, the elders, and all the council sought false testimony against Jesus for to put him to death, but found none, even though many false witnesses came forward, but their testimony did not agree. But at last 2 false witnesses came forward and gave false testimony against him and said, "We heard him say, I can and will destroy the temple of God that is made with hands, and within 3 days I will build another made without hands. And yet not even then did their testimony agree. And the high priest stood up in the midst and asked Jesus, saying, Do you answer nothing? What is it these men testify against you? But Jesus kept silent and answered nothing. And again the high priest asked him, saying to him, Are you the Christ, the Son of the Most Blessed? I adjure you by the living God that you tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God. And Jesus said to him, It is as you said, I am. Hereafter you will see the Son of Man sitting on the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. And then the high priest tore his garments, saying, He hath spoken blasphemy. What further need do we need of witnesses? Look now, you have heard his blasphemy. What do you think? And they all condemned him, saying, He is guilty of death. And the men who held Jesus mocked him and spat in his face and beat him. Others blindfolded him and struck him in the face, saying, Prophesy to us, Christ. Who is it that struck you? And many other such things they blasphemously spoke against him. And when the morning was come, all the chief priests and elders of the people came together and took counsel concerning Jesus for to put him to death. And they led him into their council, saying, If you are the Christ, tell us. And he said unto them, If I tell you, you will not believe me. And if I also ask you, you will by no means answer me or let me go. And hereafter the Son of Man will sit on the right hand of the power of God. Then they all said, Are you then the Son of God? And he said unto them, You rightly say that I am. And they said, What further testimony do we need? For we ourselves have heard it from his very own mouth. And then the whole multitude of them arose and bound Jesus, and led him from Caiaphas to the praetorium. And it was early. And then Judas, who had betrayed him, when he saw that he was condemned to death, felt remorse, and brought back the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and elders, saying, I have sinned, and that I have betrayed innocent blood. And they said, What's that to us? See to that yourself. And he threw down the pieces of silver in the temple, and he departed and went and hanged himself. And he burst open in the middle, and all his entrails gushed out. And the chief priests took the silver pieces, saying, It's not lawful to put them into the treasury, because they are the price of blood. And they took counsel and bought with them the potter's field to bury strangers in. And it became known to all those dwelling in Jerusalem, so that to this day that field is called in their own language Akeldama, that is, the field of blood. Then was fulfilled what was spoken by Jeremy the prophet, saying, And they took the 30 pieces of silver, the value of him who was priced, whom they of the children of Israel priced, and gave them for the potter's field, as the Lord directed me. But the Jews did not go into the praetorium, lest they should be defiled, but that they might eat the Passover. Pilate then went out to them and said, What accusation do you bring against this man? And they answered and said unto him, If he were not an evildoer, we would not have delivered him up to you. Then Pilate said unto them, You take him and judge him according to your law. Therefore the Jews said unto him, It is not lawful for us to put anyone to death. that the saying of Jesus might be fulfilled, which he spake, signifying by what death he would die. And the chief priests and the elders began to accuse him vehemently, saying, "We found this fellow perverting the nation and forbidding to pay taxes to Caesar, saying that he himself is Christ, a king." Then Pilate entered the praetorium again, called Jesus, and asked him, saying, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus stood before him and answered, "Are you speaking for yourself, or did others tell you this about me?" And Pilate answered, "Am I a Jew? Your own nation and the chief priests have delivered you to me. What have you done?" Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then my servants would fight so that I should not be delivered to the Jews. But now my kingdom is not from here." Pilate therefore said unto him, "Are you a king then?" Jesus answered, "You say rightly that I am a king. For this cause I was born, and for this cause came I into the world, that I should bear witness to the truth. And everyone who is of the truth hears my voice." Pilate said unto him, "What is truth?" And when he had said this, he went out again to the Jews and said to them, "I find no fault in him at all." And the chief priests and elders accused him of many things, but he answered nothing. And Pilate asked him again, saying, "Do you answer nothing? See how many things they testify against you. Do you not hear?" But Jesus still answered nothing, so that Pilate marveled. But they were the more fierce, saying, "He stirs up the people, teaching throughout all Judea, beginning from Galilee to this place." And when Pilate heard of Galilee, he asked if the man were a Galilean. And as soon as he knew that he belonged to Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod, who himself also was in Jerusalem at that time. And when Herod saw Jesus, he was exceeding glad, for he had desired for a long time to see him, because he had heard many things about him, and he had hoped to see some miracle done by him. And he questioned him with many words, but he answered him nothing. And the chief priests and the scribes stood and vehemently accused him. And Herod, with his men of war, treated him with contempt and mocked him, and arrayed him in a gorgeous robe, and sent him back unto Pilate. And that same day Pilate and Herod became mutual friends, but before they had been at enmity between themselves. And Pilate, when he had called together the chief priests, the rulers, and the people, said to them, "You have brought this man to me as one who misleads the people. And indeed, I, having examined him in your presence, I have found no fault in this man concerning those things of which you accuse him. No, nor did Herod, for I sent you back to him, and indeed nothing worthy of death has been done by him. I will therefore chastise him and release him." Now at the feast the governor was accustomed to releasing to the multitude one prisoner whom they wished. And there was at that time a notorious prisoner named Barabbas, who had been thrown into prison with his fellow insurrectionists, who had committed murder in the insurrection made in the city. And the multitude, crying aloud, began to ask him to do just as he had always done for them. And when they gathered together, Pilate answered, "You have a custom that I should release someone to you at the Passover. Whom do you want me to release to you, Barabbas or Jesus, the King of the Jews, who is called Christ?" For he knew that the chief priests had delivered him because of envy. And while he was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife said unto him, saying, "Have nothing to do with that just man, for I have suffered many things today in a dream because of him." But the chief priests and the elders stirred up the people and persuaded them that they should ask for Barabbas and destroy Jesus. The governor answered and said unto them, Which of the two do you want me to release to you? And the whole crowd cried out, saying, Away with this man, and release to us Barabbas. And Pilate, therefore, wishing to release Jesus, spoke again to them, What then shall I do with Jesus, who is called Christ? And they all said unto him, Crucify him! Crucify him! And he said to them the third time, Why, what evil has he done? I found no reason for death in him. I will therefore chastise him and let him go. And they cried out more exceedingly, Crucify him! And they were insistent, demanding with loud voices that he be crucified. And the voices of these men and of the chief priests prevailed. And Pilate took Jesus and scourged him. And the soldiers of the governor took Jesus into the praetorium and gathered the whole band of soldiers around him. And they stripped him and put a scarlet robe upon him, and they had twisted a crown out of thorns, and they put it upon his head, and a reed in his right hand. And they bowed the knee before him and mocked him and began to salute him, saying, Hail, King of the Jews! And they struck him in the face and spat upon him, and took the reed and struck him upon the head. And bowing the knee, they feigned worship of him. And Pilate then went out again and said unto them, Behold the man, I'm bringing him out to you, that I may know, and you may know that I find no fault in him. Then Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. And Pilate said again to them, Behold the man! Therefore, when the chief priests and the officers saw him, they cried out again, saying, Crucify him! Crucify him! Pilate said to them, You take him and crucify him, for I find no fault in him. The Jews answered him, We have a law, and by our law he ought to die, because he made himself the Son of God. Therefore, when Pilate heard that saying, he was the more afraid, and went again into the praetorium and said unto Jesus, Where are you from? But Jesus gave him no answer. Then Pilate said to him, Are you not speaking to me? Do you not know that I have power to crucify you and power to release you? And Jesus answered, You could have no power at all against me unless it had been given you from above. Therefore the one who delivered me to you has the greater sin. From then on Pilate sought to release him, but the Jews cried out, saying, If you let this man go, you are not Caesar's friend. Whoever makes himself a king speaks against Caesar. And when Pilate therefore heard that saying, he brought Jesus out and sat down in the judgment seat in a place that is called the Pavement, but in Hebrew, Gabbatha. And it was the preparation day of the Passover, about the 6th hour. And he said to the Jews, Behold your king. But they cried out, Away with him! Away with him! Crucify him! Pilate said unto them, Shall I crucify your king? And the chief priests answered, We have no king but Caesar. And when Pilate saw that he could not prevail at all, but rather that a tumult was rising, he gave sentence that it should be as they requested. And he took water, and he washed his hands before the multitude, saying, I am innocent of the blood of this righteous man. You see to it. And all the people answered, saying, His blood be upon us and upon our children. Then he released to them Barabbas, whom they requested, who had been thrown in prison for insurrection and murder, but he delivered Jesus after he had scourged him to their will to be crucified.